Disasters are one of the major challenges faced by societies today. Earthquakes, floods, storms, and other types of disasters affect not only the physical environment but also social life and economic systems. Especially in urban areas, increasing population density and complex infrastructure systems cause the impacts of disasters to be felt more severely. For this reason, disasters should not be considered only as events that are addressed at the moment they occur, but as processes that need to be evaluated within a broader framework. The measures taken before disasters, the level of preparedness, and the actions carried out after disasters directly shape how societies are affected by these events. The concept of disaster management becomes important precisely at this point. Reducing losses caused by disasters, increasing society's level of preparedness, and supporting the orderly recovery of life after disasters are among the main objectives of disaster management. In this presentation, the basic approach to disaster management and the key concepts in this field will be discussed. The content of this presentation is structured to address disaster management within a systematic and clear framework. First, the general scope and main purpose of disaster management will be introduced. At this stage, it will be emphasized why disaster management should not be limited only to response activities and why a more comprehensive approach is required. Next, the multidisciplinary approach in disaster management will be addressed. The contributions of different institutions, disciplines, and actors to the process will be explained, and the roles of public institutions, local governments, the private sector, and civil society will be highlighted. This section aims to demonstrate that disaster management is not a single-actor process. The presentation will then focus on the main phases of disaster management. The concepts of risk management and crisis management will be explained, and mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery processes will be discussed as interconnected and continuous stages. Following this, the main challenges encountered in disaster management will be outlined. Issues such as institutional coordination problems, gaps in preparedness and training, as well as resource and logistics management challenges will be addressed. Finally, the concept of community resilience will be introduced. The importance of resilient communities in disaster contexts will be explained, and the role of community resilience in building sustainable and disaster-resilient cities will be emphasized. When approaching the topic of disaster management, it is first necessary to clarify what this field actually includes. Disaster management is often associated only with response activities carried out during a disaster. However, this perspective explains only a small part of the overall process. In order to reduce the impacts of disasters, identifying risks in advance, carrying out the necessary preparedness measures, and managing the recovery process in a planned manner are all essential. At the same time, disaster management is not an area that can be handled by a single institution or discipline. Planning, governance, environmental considerations, economic structures, and social dynamics are all integral parts of this process. Cooperation among different actors makes it possible to develop more effective and sustainable solutions to disasters. Within this framework, the reasons why key challenges in disaster management and the concept of community resilience play a critical role become clearer. In this way, the relationship between disaster management and resilient and sustainable cities is more clearly revealed. When disaster management is considered, one of the most fundamental points is that this process cannot be carried out by a single discipline or institution. Disasters affect many different systems at the same time, which makes cooperation across multiple fields and actors essential. Technical infrastructure, social structures, economic systems, and environmental conditions all directly shape the impacts of disasters. For this reason, disaster management cannot be evaluated only through engineering solutions or emergency response capacity. It requires the combined contribution of fields such as planning, architecture, environmental sciences, economics, governance, and the social sciences. For example, safe land use and building practices are closely linked to planning and architecture. Accurate risk identification depends on environmental and technical analyses, and public awareness and participation are related to social dimensions. At the same time, public institutions, local governments, the private sector, and civil society organizations are key actors in disaster management. Cooperation among these actors enables more effective and sustainable responses to disasters. A multidisciplinary approach transforms disaster management from fragmented actions into a coordinated and holistic process. The main purpose of disaster management is to reduce loss of life and damage caused by disasters to the lowest possible level. However, this purpose is not limited only to actions taken during a disaster. Measures taken before disasters, the level of preparedness, and public awareness all directly shape the outcomes of disasters. Disaster management aims to identify risks in advance and to take the necessary precautions against these risks. In this way, even if disasters cannot be completely prevented, their impacts can be significantly reduced. At the same time, meeting basic needs after a disaster and reorganizing daily life are also essential components of disaster management. Within this framework, disaster management does not represent an approach focused only on moments of crisis. Instead, it refers to a continuous management process that includes pre-disaster, during disaster, and post-disaster stages. Ensuring public safety, minimizing economic losses, and restoring social order as quickly as possible are among the shared objectives of disaster management. Disaster management is addressed through specific phases in order to make disaster-related activities easier to understand. These phases provide a clear framework by indicating when different actions are carried out and for what purpose. Within this framework, disaster management is generally examined under two main categories: risk management and crisis management. Risk management covers the activities conducted before a disaster occurs and focuses on reducing potential impacts and losses. Crisis management, on the other hand, includes response and recovery activities that begin once a disaster takes place. At this stage, mitigation and preparedness efforts aim to limit the effects of disasters, while response and recovery processes focus on meeting post-disaster needs and reorganizing daily life. This classification makes it possible to examine the different components of disaster management more clearly and to define the activities carried out at each phase in a structured manner. Disaster risk management refers to all activities carried out before a disaster occurs. The main focus of this approach is to anticipate the potential impacts of disasters and to develop measures that reduce possible losses. Although disasters cannot always be prevented, their impacts can be significantly minimized through effective risk management. Disaster risk management includes identifying hazards, determining exposed areas and vulnerable groups, and analyzing potential damages. In this process, risk is evaluated not only in relation to natural hazards but also by considering human-related factors such as settlement patterns, building conditions, infrastructure, and social vulnerability. For this reason, disaster risk management requires a long-term and planned approach. Accurately identifying risks creates a strong foundation for effective mitigation and preparedness efforts. In this way, before reaching the response stage, the goal is to reduce potential losses and to strengthen the resilience of communities against disasters. Mitigation is one of the most important stages of disaster risk management. The main objective of this stage is to minimize the potential damages caused by disasters through measures taken before a disaster occurs. Mitigation does not aim to completely prevent disasters, but rather to limit their impacts. Activities carried out within this stage generally include both structural and non-structural measures. Structural measures involve strengthening buildings, improving infrastructure systems, and ensuring the safety of critical facilities. Non-structural measures include land use decisions, regulatory frameworks, and risk-based planning approaches. Identifying high-risk areas and vulnerable groups also plays a key role in the mitigation process. Such analyses help to determine which areas and populations are likely to be more severely affected in the event of a disaster. As a result, measures taken before disasters can be more targeted and effective. Preparedness is one of the core components of disaster risk management, together with mitigation. The aim of this stage is to ensure that societies and institutions are as ready as possible for potential disasters when they cannot be fully prevented. Preparedness seeks to reduce uncertainty and losses that may occur during a disaster. Within the scope of preparedness, disaster response plans are developed, roles and responsibilities are clearly defined, and mechanisms for interinstitutional cooperation are established. At the same time, training response teams, maintaining emergency equipment, and creating stocks for basic needs are essential parts of this process. Drills and training activities are also indispensable elements of the preparedness stage. These activities allow both institutions and communities to practice how to act during a disaster. As a result, when a disaster occurs, the response process can be carried out more quickly, in a more coordinated manner, and more effectively. When a disaster occurs, the focus of disaster management shifts to rapid and effective response. At this stage, the primary objective is to save as many lives as possible and to respond quickly to urgent needs caused by the disaster. Search and rescue operations, first aid services, and the provision of basic needs are the main priorities during this period. Coordination is critically important during and immediately after a disaster. Establishing crisis centers, clarifying roles and responsibilities, and ensuring effective information flow directly influence the success of the response process. At the same time, logistics management is one of the most critical components of this stage. Food, shelter, health services, and other essential resources must be delivered to the right places at the right time. In the period following the disaster, temporary shelter solutions, psychosocial support, and the restoration of basic services become the main focus. This stage represents a critical transition period that allows communities to adapt back to daily life and lays the foundation for longer-term recovery efforts. The recovery stage represents the longer-term dimension of the post-disaster process. The main goal at this stage is to restore disrupted living conditions in a permanent and sustainable way. Recovery focuses not only on repairing physical damage, but also on revitalizing social and economic life. Within this scope, the construction of permanent housing, the repair of infrastructure systems, and the restoration of basic services are among the priority activities. At the same time, supporting economic activities and reducing the social impacts caused by disasters are important components of the recovery process. A key point to consider during the recovery stage is that the goal is not simply to return to pre-disaster conditions, but to build a safer and more resilient environment. For this reason, new settlements and infrastructure systems should be planned in a way that is resilient to future disasters. In this way, the recovery process becomes a stage that supports not only rebuilding, but also long-term risk reduction. Although disaster management is often discussed through specific phases, these phases should not be considered as independent processes. All activities carried out before, during, and after a disaster are interconnected and form parts of a single whole. For this reason, disaster management is better understood as a continuous cycle rather than a linear sequence of actions. The accurate identification of risks and effective mitigation efforts directly influence the level of preparedness. In the same way, plans and training conducted during the preparedness stage shape the success of response activities during a disaster. Experiences gained during the response phase also provide valuable input for recovery efforts and for future risk management activities. This integrated structure shows that disaster management cannot be carried out effectively by focusing on only one stage. Each phase is connected to the others, and weaknesses in any stage can negatively affect the entire process. Therefore, disaster management should be approached through an integrated management framework that ensures coordination and continuity across all phases. Although disaster management is a comprehensive and planned process, various challenges are encountered in practice. These challenges can increase the impacts of disasters and limit the effectiveness of management efforts. For this reason, it is important to focus not only on good practices, but also on the key problems faced in disaster management. One of the most common challenges in this field is the lack of institutional coordination. Unclear roles and responsibilities among different institutions and actors can make decision-making and response processes more difficult during disasters. In addition, the insufficient adoption of risk-based planning approaches often leads to delays in taking necessary measures before disasters occur. Insufficient levels of preparedness and training are also among the major factors that negatively affect disaster management. Plans remaining only on paper, limited drills, and gaps in knowledge increase uncertainty during disaster situations. Furthermore, problems related to resource and logistics management are other significant challenges that directly influence the effectiveness of the response process. The challenges encountered in disaster management do not emerge in a single area, rather, they appear across multiple dimensions. For this reason, examining these challenges in a categorized way helps to better understand why disaster management is such a complex process. Technical challenges include issues such as inadequate infrastructure, building safety problems, and the limited capacity of early warning systems. These issues can increase the physical impacts of disasters. Institutional and governance-related challenges are associated with the distribution of authority, decision-making processes, and coordination among institutions. The absence of clear and effective governance structures can lead to disruptions at every stage of disaster management. Social challenges are linked to public awareness, levels of participation, and the situation of vulnerable groups. Social inequalities can cause disasters to have more severe impacts on certain populations. Economic challenges are related to limited resources and financing constraints. Environmental challenges arise from factors such as ecosystem degradation and climate change, both of which increase disaster risks. This multidimensional structure clearly demonstrates that technical solutions alone are not sufficient for effective disaster management. In disaster management, the concept of community resilience stands out as one of the most important factors shaping disaster outcomes. Community resilience refers to a society's capacity to prepare for disasters, adapt during disaster situations, and recover after disasters. This capacity depends not only on physical infrastructure but also on social structures and institutional relationships. One of the key components of community resilience is social capital. Trust, solidarity, and neighborhood ties within a community make it easier for individuals to support one another during disasters. Awareness and education help communities recognize risks and behave more consciously in disaster situations. Participation and governance support the inclusion of communities in decision-making processes and contribute to more effective outcomes. Economic capacity directly affects the ability of individuals and households to recover after disasters. Access to information reduces uncertainty by ensuring that accurate and timely information reaches communities. When these components are considered together, it becomes clear that community resilience is an integral part of effective disaster management. When community resilience is strong, the outcomes of disasters differ significantly. Differences observed between communities exposed to the same type of disaster are often related not only to physical conditions, but also to the level of community resilience. Resilient communities are better prepared for disasters, which allows them to limit losses and adapt more quickly during the post-disaster period. In such communities, solidarity mechanisms function more effectively during disasters. Individuals and local networks can activate basic support mechanisms even before official response teams arrive in the affected areas. This contributes to reducing casualties, especially during the first critical hours. At the same time, in communities with better access to information, misinformation and uncertainty tend to be more limited. After disasters, community resilience directly influences the speed of recovery. Communities with stronger economic capacity, higher levels of participation, and functioning governance mechanisms are able to reorganize daily life in a shorter period of time. For this reason, community resilience should be regarded not as a complementary element, but as a central component of disaster management. Although disasters affect entire societies, their impacts are not experienced equally. Persons with disabilities and elderly populations face higher risks due to accessibility barriers and limited mobility. Children are more vulnerable both physically and psychologically. Women and girls often encounter increased caregiving responsibilities and gender-based risks after disasters. Migrants and refugees have limited access to information and assistance because of language and legal barriers. Low-income communities and those living in informal settlements are frequently located in high-risk areas and are disproportionately affected by disasters. Therefore, inclusive disaster management is a fundamental component of equity and social justice. Disaster management is not a process limited to actions taken during a disaster. It represents a management approach that begins before disasters occur and continues after they end, emphasizing continuity. For this reason, effective disaster management requires the early identification of risks, the systematic implementation of preparedness activities, and the sustainable management of the post-disaster period. Within this process, a multidisciplinary approach emerges as a fundamental requirement. Disasters are complex events with technical, social, economic, and environmental dimensions, and this complexity makes cooperation among different disciplines and actors essential. Ensuring institutional coordination and strengthening planning processes directly influence the effectiveness of disaster management. At the same time, the challenges faced in disaster management arise not only from technical limitations, but also from issues related to governance, social structures, and resource management. At this point, the concept of community resilience stands out as a critical factor shaping disaster outcomes. Resilient communities are better prepared for disasters, experience fewer losses, and adapt more quickly to post-disaster conditions. Within this framework, disaster management should be regarded as a key tool in building resilient and sustainable societies. Disasters may be unavoidable, but the losses they cause are not. An effective disaster management approach requires understanding risks in advance, being prepared, and actively involving communities in these processes. This perspective forms the foundation for building safer and more resilient societies. The approaches discussed in this presentation are supported by widely recognized studies in the international disaster management and resilience literature. The references listed at the end provide a useful starting point for those who wish to explore these topics in greater depth.